The sound of the barn door slamming shut echoed through Martha Delaney's bones as she stumbled forward into the darkness, her father's angry shouts still ringing in her ears even after the heavy wooden beam dropped into place outside. She pressed her palms against the rough wood, splinters catching her skin, and fought back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. At 21 years old, she was far too grown to be locked away like a disobedient child, but her father had never been one to see reason when whiskey clouded his judgment and rage filled his heart. The barn smelled of hay and horses, familiar scents that should have brought comfort, but instead only reminded her of how trapped she truly was. Her father owned one of the larger ranches outside Oro Blanco, Arizona territory, and he ruled it with an iron fist that had only grown heavier since her mother passed 3 years prior. Tonight's transgression had been speaking up during dinner when he announced his intention to marry her off to Samuel Hutchins, a wealthy rancher twice her age with a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond his livestock. Martha had made the mistake of saying no. The moon cast thin, silvery lines through the gaps in the barn walls, providing just enough light for her to navigate toward a pile of hay in the corner. She sank down onto it, wrapping her arms around her knees, and tried to think of a way out of this situation that did not involve submitting to her father's will. The evening air held a bite that promised autumn was coming to the Arizona high country, and she had nothing but the thin cotton dress she wore. Her father had said she would stay in the barn until she learned to be obedient, until she understood that women did not have the luxury of choice. She would rather freeze than marry Samuel Hutchins. Hours passed slowly. Martha dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound, her body aching from the cold and the uncomfortable position. She had nearly drifted off again when the unmistakable sound of horse hooves approaching made her sit upright, her heart hammering in her chest. It was well past midnight, far too late for any honest business. She held her breath, listening as the horse came to a stop somewhere near the barn. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the structure. Martha scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the wall, unsure whether this new development was salvation or something worse. The footsteps stopped at the barn door, and she heard the sound of someone testing the beam that held it shut. A man's voice, low and careful, spoke from the other side. "Anyone in there?" Martha's throat went dry. She did not recognize the voice, which meant it was not one of her father's ranch hands. "Who's asking?" There was a pause, then the voice came again, warmer this time, almost amused. "Someone who doesn't think it's right to lock people in barns. You hurt?" "No," Martha said, moving closer to the door. "But I cannot get out. My father locked me in here." Another pause, longer this time. "Your father did this. What kind of man locks up his own daughter?" "The kind who drinks too much and thinks women are property to be sold," Martha said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. She heard the man move, heard the sound of wood scraping against wood as he lifted the beam. For a moment, panic seized her. What if this stranger was worse than her father? What if she was trading one prison for another? But then the door swung open and moonlight flooded in, and Martha found herself looking up at a tall figure silhouetted against the night sky. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out more details. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a lean, rangy build that spoke of long days in the saddle. He wore the typical garb of a working cowboy, dusty trousers and a worn shirt, with a bandana tied loosely around his neck. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even in the dim light. They were kind, concerned, completely unlike the calculating hardness she had seen in Samuel Hutchins' gaze. "Graham Vance," he said, extending his hand toward her. "I work at the Davidson Ranch about 10 miles south. Was riding back late from town when I heard someone moving around in here. Seemed strange this time of night." Martha took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work, the warmth that chased away some of the cold that had settled into her bones. "Martha Delaney, I appreciate your help, but you should probably go before my father wakes up. He won't take kindly to someone interfering." Graham's jaw tightened. "I don't take kindly to men who treat their daughters like animals. Come on, let's get you out of here." "And go where?" Martha asked, the question that had been haunting her all evening finally spoken aloud. "He owns this ranch. He owns half the businesses in Oro Blanco. Where can I possibly go that he won't find me?" Graham looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Davidson Ranch is always looking for help. Mrs. Davidson runs a boarding house on the property for the workers. You could stay there, at least until you figure something out. She's a good woman, wouldn't turn away someone in need." It was madness. Running away with a complete stranger, leaving everything she had ever known, burning every bridge behind her. But as Martha thought about the alternative, about being forced into marriage with Samuel Hutchins, about a lifetime of being her father's property and then her husband's, the choice suddenly seemed very clear. "All right," she said. "Let's go." Graham nodded and led her out of the barn toward where his horse waited, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes. "She can carry us both to Davidson's place. It's going to be a long ride, and we should get moving before your father discovers you are gone." He helped Martha up onto the horse, then swung up behind her. The contact made her suddenly aware of how improper this all was, how scandalous it would be if anyone saw them. But propriety seemed like a small concern compared to freedom. Graham's arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she felt the solid warmth of him at her back, steady and reassuring. They rode out quietly, keeping to the shadows, moving away from the ranch house where her father slept off his whiskey. Martha did not look back. Looking back felt like an invitation to doubt, and she could not afford doubt right now. The Arizona night was beautiful in its own harsh way, the sky vast and filled with more stars than anyone could count, the desert landscape painted in shades of silver and shadow. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's gait lulling Martha into a strange sense of calm despite everything that had happened. Finally, Graham spoke. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but what did you do that made your father lock you up like that?" Martha hesitated, then decided this man who had rescued her deserved honesty. "He wants me to marry Samuel Hutchins. I refused." She felt Graham tense behind her. "Samuel Hutchins. I have heard stories about him, none of them good." "Then you understand why I said no. My father sees only Hutchins' money and influence. He does not care that the man has driven 2 wives to early graves. Both died." Graham's voice was sharp. "The first in childbirth, but the second under circumstances no one talks about. She fell, supposedly, down the stairs." Martha's hands clenched in her lap. "I saw her in town once, maybe a month before she died. She had bruises on her arms, and she flinched when Hutchins raised his hand to adjust his hat. I will not be his third wife." "No," Graham agreed quietly. "You will not." They rode on through the night, covering the miles at a steady pace. Graham proved to be an excellent horseman, guiding them along paths that avoided the main road, keeping them hidden. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to catch up with Martha. The fear and cold of the barn, combined with the stress of escape, weighed on her. She found herself leaning back against Graham, and he adjusted his position to support her more comfortably. "Rest if you need to," he said softly. "I have got you," and strangely, Martha believed him. This man she had known for barely an hour had already shown her more kindness and consideration than her father had in years. She let her eyes drift closed, trusting Graham to keep them safe. When she woke, dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, and they were approaching a collection of buildings that looked well-maintained and prosperous. The main ranch house was a sprawling adobe structure with a wide porch, and beyond it stood several barns, corrals, and what looked like a long bunkhouse. A separate building, smaller but still substantial, had curtains in the windows and flowers planted along the front. "That's the boarding house," Graham said, noticing where Martha's gaze had landed. "Mrs. Davidson lives in the main house, but she takes her meals with the boarders most days. Says it keeps her from getting lonely since Mr. Davidson passed." He guided the horse toward the boarding house and dismounted, then reached up to help Martha down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. Graham steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch gentle but sure. The front door of the boarding house opened, and a woman emerged. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that took in the scene before her with obvious curiosity. She wore a simple but clean dress with an apron tied at her waist, and there was something about her bearing that commanded respect. "Graham Vance," she said, her voice carrying a note of amusement. "What have you brought me at this ungodly hour, morning, Mrs. Davidson?" Graham said, respectful but not obsequious. "This is Martha Delaney. She is in need of a safe place to stay, and I was hoping you might have room for her, Mrs. Davidson's sharp eyes moved to Martha, taking in the thin dress, the hay still clinging to her hair, the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Her expression softened. "Come inside, child. You look half frozen. Graham, see to your horse and then come in for breakfast. I want to hear the whole story." The interior of the boarding house was warm and welcoming, with whitewashed walls and simple but comfortable furniture. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, making Martha's stomach growl loudly. She could not remember the last time she had eaten. Mrs. Davidson led her to a seat at the large kitchen table and pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "Drink that. I will get you some food." Graham entered a few minutes later, having taken care of his horse. He took a seat across from Martha, and Mrs. Davidson set plates of bacon, eggs, and fresh bread before them both. For a few minutes, the only sounds were of eating, Martha devouring the food with an appetite born of hunger and stress. Finally, Mrs. Davidson settled into a chair at the head of the table, her own cup of coffee in hand. "Now then, tell me what happened." Between them, Martha and Graham explained the situation. Mrs. Davidson's expression grew progressively grimmer as the story unfolded, particularly when they mentioned Samuel Hutchins. "That man," she said with feeling when they finished, "should have been run out of the territory years ago, but he has money, and money buys a lot of forgiveness in these parts." She turned to Martha. "You were right to run, and you," she nodded at Graham, "did the right thing helping her. Of course you can stay here, Martha. I always have room for someone in genuine need." Relief flooded through Martha so intensely that her eyes stung with tears. "Thank you, I can work. I am good with cooking, cleaning, mending. I can earn my keep." "We will discuss that later, Mrs. Davidson said kindly. "Right now, you need rest. Let me show you to a room." She led Martha upstairs to a small but comfortable room with a real bed, clean linens, and a window that looked out over the ranch. "There is water in the pitcher for washing, and I will bring up some clothes that should fit you reasonably well. My daughter left some things behind when she married last year. Sleep as long as you need. No one will disturb you." After Mrs. Davidson left, Martha stripped off her dirty dress and washed with the cool water, scrubbing away the hay and dust and fear of the previous night. The dress Mrs. Davidson brought was a simple blue calico, worn but well made and much warmer than what Martha had been wearing. She put it on, then crawled into the bed and was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The barn, Graham, the escape. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, half expecting to find it had all been a dream and she was still locked in that cold, dark space. But no. She was in a real room with sunlight streaming through the window, and she was safe. The realization brought such profound relief that she had to sit for a moment just breathing, letting it sink in. A gentle knock on the door made her start. "Come in," she called. Mrs. Davidson entered, carrying a tray with sandwiches and tea. "Thought you might be hungry when you woke." "It is nearly 2 in the afternoon. You were exhausted, poor thing." "I am sorry for sleeping so late," Martha said, taking the tray gratefully. "Nonsense. Your body needed rest." Mrs. Davidson settled into the chair by the window. "Now we need to discuss some practical matters. Your father is going to come looking for you." The sandwich turned to ash in Martha's mouth. "I know. When he does, I will tell him I have not seen you, so will everyone else on this ranch, but you should know that legally, he has rights as your father. If he finds you, he can drag you back home, and there is not much anyone can do about it." "I will not go back," Martha said, her voice hard. "I will run again if I have to." "That might not be necessary. There is another option." Mrs. Davidson leaned forward. "Marriage. Once you are married, your husband has legal authority over you instead of your father. Now, before you protest, I am not suggesting you jump from one bad situation into another. But it is something to consider. If you were to find someone you could trust, someone who would give you that legal protection without actually forcing you into anything you did not want." Martha's mind immediately went to Graham, then she pushed the thought away, embarrassed. The man had barely met her. Why would he agree to such an arrangement? As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Davidson smiled slightly. "Graham is a good man, one of the best I have working here. Honest, hard-working, kind. He has been saving his wages for years, hoping to buy his own piece of land someday. He is not the type to take advantage." "I barely know him," Martha said weakly. "True. And I am not saying you should marry him tomorrow, but you might consider getting to know him. See if he might be someone you could trust with this." Mrs. Davidson rose. "Think about it. In the meantime, you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. There is always plenty of work if you want to help out. The men appreciate having someone who can cook and mend, and I could use another pair of hands keeping this place in order." After Mrs. Davidson left, Martha sat for a long time thinking. Marriage had been the very thing she was running from, but she could see the practical wisdom in Mrs. Davidson's suggestion. The law was not on her side. Her father could claim her, force her back, make her marry Samuel Hutchins. But if she were already married, that would no longer be an option. The question was whether Graham would agree to such an arrangement, and more importantly, whether Martha could bear the idea of marriage even to someone who seemed kind. She had seen what marriage did to women, how it trapped them, how they became property in all but name. Her mother had loved her father once, but that love had not protected her from his anger, his drinking, his casual cruelty. But Graham had broken down a door to free her. He had asked nothing in return, had offered help without expectation. That had to mean something. She finished her meal and went downstairs, finding Mrs. Davidson in the kitchen peeling potatoes. "Can I help?" "Of course." Mrs. Davidson gestured to a second chair and handed her a knife and potato. They worked in companionable silence for a while, and Martha found the simple, repetitive task soothing. "I have been thinking about what you said," Martha ventured after a while. "About marriage. If Graham were willing, would it have to be a real marriage?" Mrs. Davidson considered this. "In the eyes of the law, it would have to appear real. But what happens between a husband and wife in private is their own business. If you and Graham came to an understanding, an agreement about the terms of the marriage, I do not see why it could not work the way you wanted it to." That seems like a lot to ask of someone. To tie themselves to a stranger legally but have none of the usual benefits of marriage. You might be surprised. Graham is lonely, I think. He works hard, saves his money, but he has no family, no real home. Maybe the idea of a partner, even an unconventional one, would appeal to him. They finished the potatoes and started on the dinner preparations. Martha found herself falling easily into the work, and it felt good to be useful, to be doing something productive rather than locked away in punishment. As the afternoon wore on, ranch hands began trickling in, washing up at the pump outside before entering for their evening meal. Graham came in with the last group, dusty and tired from a day's work. His eyes found Martha immediately, and something in his expression lightened. He cleaned up and took a seat at the long table, nodding a greeting to her. Dinner was a boisterous affair, the men talking and joking, discussing the day's work and making plans for tomorrow. Martha served the food alongside Mrs. Davidson, and she noticed how respectful the men were, how they thanked her and minded their language in her presence. This was nothing like her father's ranch, where the hands had been rough and crude, reflecting the man who employed them. After dinner, as Martha was clearing the dishes, Graham approached her. "Could I speak with you for a moment? Outside, maybe." Martha's heart jumped, but she nodded. She followed him out onto the porch, where the evening air was cool and the sky was beginning its transformation from blue to deep purple. They stood side by side at the railing, looking out over the ranch. "Mrs. Davidson spoke to me this afternoon," Graham said without preamble, "about your situation and about a possible solution." So Mrs. Davidson had already approached him. Martha was not sure if she was grateful or mortified. "I hope she did not pressure you. It was just an idea." "She did not pressure me. She just laid out the facts." Graham turned to face her, leaning against the railing. "Your father is going to come looking for you. When he does, you will need protection that goes beyond just hiding. Legal protection." "I know." Martha twisted her hands together. "But marriage is asking a lot. We do not know each other." "That is true," Graham agreed. "But we could get to know each other. And if we decided it would work, I would be willing to marry you. Not because Mrs. Davidson asked, but because I think everyone deserves to be free to make their own choices. What your father is trying to do to you, what Hutchins would do if he got the chance, it is not right." Martha looked at him carefully, trying to read his expression in the fading light. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Graham was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My mother was married to a man who hurt her. Not my father, but her second husband after my father died. I was too young to do anything about it, too small to protect her. By the time I was old enough to try, she was already dead. He said she fell, like they said about Hutchins' second wife." The pain in his voice was old but still sharp. Martha felt something in her chest tighten with sympathy. "I am sorry. So am I. But maybe I can keep history from repeating itself. Maybe I can help you avoid the same fate." He looked directly at her. "I will not lie and say I am being completely selfless. Mrs. Davidson was right when she told you I have been saving to buy land. A married man has better prospects, looks more stable, and having a partner, someone to build something with, that appeals to me. But I want you to know upfront that I would not expect, would not demand, anything from you that you are not willing to give. We could make our own arrangement, our own rules. It was more than Martha had dared hope for, a way out that did not involve simply trading one prison for another. But still, doubt nagged at her. What if you meet someone else later, someone you actually want to marry for real? I would not want to trap you the way my father tried to trap me. Then we will deal with that if it happens. But Martha, I am 25 years old. I have met a lot of women. I am not holding out for some fairy tale romance. I just want a decent life with someone I can respect, someone I can trust. Maybe we could build that together. Martha turned to look out over the ranch again, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. What Graham was offering was more than safety. It was respect, partnership, choice, things she had never expected to have. "All right," she said finally. "Let us try. Get to know each other, see if we could actually make this work." She could see Graham's smile even in the darkness. "All right then." Over the next week, Martha settled into life at the boarding house. She helped Mrs. Davidson with cooking and cleaning, mended clothes for the ranch hands, and gradually began to relax, to feel like maybe she really had escaped. Her father did not come looking for her, and she began to hope that perhaps he had decided she was not worth the trouble. She was wrong. He came on a Saturday afternoon, riding up to the ranch with Samuel Hutchins and two of his ranch hands. Martha saw them from the kitchen window and felt ice flood her veins. "He is here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Davidson looked out the window, her expression hardening. "Go upstairs and stay there. Do not come down no matter what you hear." But Martha could not hide upstairs while others fought her battle. Instead, she moved to stand behind Mrs. Davidson as the older woman went out onto the porch to meet the visitors. Several ranch hands had noticed the arrivals and were drifting closer, including Graham, who positioned himself near the porch steps. Thomas Delaney dismounted, his face red with anger. "I am here for my daughter." "I am afraid I do not know what you are talking about," Mrs. Davidson said calmly. "Do not play games with me, woman. I know she is here. Someone saw Vance riding through town with a woman late last week." Thomas moved toward the steps and Graham shifted to block him. "Mrs. Davidson asked you politely to leave," Graham said quietly. "You." Thomas rounded on him. "You are the one who took her. That is kidnapping, boy. I could have you arrested." "Helping someone escape unlawful imprisonment is not kidnapping," Graham said. "And locking your daughter in a barn overnight sounds pretty unlawful to me." Samuel Hutchins stepped forward. He was an older man, probably in his late 40s, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "This is a family matter. The girl is betrothed to me. Whatever nonsense her father's ranch hand told you is irrelevant." "I am not betrothed to you," Martha said, stepping forward onto the porch despite Mrs. Davidson's restraining hand. "I never agreed to marry you. I never will." Her father's face went even redder. "You will do as you are told. Now get down here and get on that horse." "No." The word came out stronger than Martha felt. "I am an adult. You cannot force me." "The hell I cannot." "You are my daughter, and until you are married, I have legal say over you." Thomas pushed past Graham, but suddenly half a dozen ranch hands were there, forming a barrier between him and the porch. "I think you should leave," Graham said, his voice still quiet but carrying a note of steel. Thomas looked around at the assembled men, clearly calculating his odds. "This is not over. I will get the sheriff involved if I have to." "You do that," Mrs. Davidson said. "And while you are at it, we can discuss with him the legality of locking grown women in barns overnight." I am sure Sheriff Morrison would be very interested in that conversation. For a moment, Martha thought her father might actually try to fight his way through. His hands were clenched into fists, and rage radiated from him in waves. But finally, he spat on the ground and turned back to his horse. "You are making a mistake, girl. You will regret this." Samuel Hutchins lingered a moment longer, his cold eyes on Martha. "We had an agreement, your father and I. I do not appreciate being made a fool of. This will not be forgotten." The threat was clear. Martha forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, and after a moment, he too turned and mounted his horse. The four men rode away, but the sense of relief Martha felt was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from over. Mrs. Davidson ushered her back inside, and Graham followed. "He is going to come back," Martha said, her hands shaking now that the confrontation was over. "He will find a way to force me back." "Not if you are married," Mrs. Davidson said firmly. She looked at Graham. "How soon can you be ready?" Graham's eyes met Martha's. "We talked about taking time to get to know each other." "I do not think we have that luxury anymore," Martha said. "My father will either come back with the sheriff or he will try to take me by force. Either way, we need to act quickly." She took a deep breath. "If you are still willing, I am ready." Graham reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady around hers. "Then we will do it. Tomorrow, if possible." "Tomorrow is Sunday," Mrs. Davidson said thoughtfully. "Reverend Patterson will be conducting services in town. We can speak with him afterward about performing the ceremony." It was all happening so fast. Yesterday Martha had been contemplating weeks of courtship, of careful evaluation. Now she was agreeing to marry a man she had known for barely a week. But the look in Samuel Hutchins' eyes had convinced her. She was out of time. That evening, she and Graham sat together on the porch after everyone else had gone to bed, talking. Really talking. They shared stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Graham told her about growing up watching his mother suffer, about his determination to never be the kind of man his stepfather had been. Martha spoke of her mother, of the slow death of her spirit under her father's thumb, of her own determination to have a different life. "I want to be clear about something," Graham said as the night grew late. "When we marry, you will have your own space, your own room. I will not expect or demand intimacy unless and until you want it. This is a partnership first, everything else second." The knot of anxiety that had been living in Martha's chest since she agreed to this loosened slightly. "Thank you. I know that is asking a lot. It is asking for basic decency and respect. That is not a lot, Martha. That is the bare minimum." Martha looked at him in the starlight, this man who was about to become her husband, and felt the first stirrings of something beyond gratitude. He was handsome, certainly, but it was more than that. There was a goodness in him, a fundamental kindness that shone through in everything he did. "I think," she said slowly, "that in time I could care for you, really care for you. This does not have to be only a business arrangement forever." Graham's hand found hers again. "I would like that. There is no rush, though. We will figure things out as we go." The next morning they dressed in their best clothes and rode into Oro Blanco with Mrs. Davidson. The town was small but bustling, situated in the high country of Arizona Territory where the air was thin and clear. The church was a simple adobe building with a wooden cross above the door, and when services let out, Mrs. Davidson approached Reverend Patterson, a kindly man in his 60s with gentle eyes. She explained the situation, omitting some of the more scandalous details, but making it clear that Martha and Graham needed to be married quickly. The Reverend looked at them both carefully. "Are you entering into this marriage of your own free will without coercion?" "Yes," they both said together. "And you understand that marriage is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly." "We do," Graham said. "And we take it seriously, Reverend. We understand the commitment we are making." Reverend Patterson studied them a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. We can perform the ceremony this afternoon. I will need 2 witnesses." Mrs. Davidson volunteered herself, and they recruited one of the ranch hands who had come to town for supplies. By 3 in the afternoon, Martha found herself standing in the small church, Graham beside her, repeating vows that would bind them together in the eyes of God and the law. "Do you, Martha and Delaney, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Martha looked at Graham, at his steady presence, at the quiet strength in his eyes. "I do." "Do you, Graham Thomas Vance, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Graham said firmly. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife." It was done. Martha was no longer Martha Delaney, subject to her father's control. She was Martha Vance, a married woman with all the legal protections that entailed. When Graham kissed her gently, briefly, to seal the ceremony, she felt as though a door had closed on one part of her life and opened onto another, uncertain but full of possibility. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife and Mrs. Davidson gave them a small cabin that sat on the edge of the property, a place where they could have privacy while still being part of the ranch community. It had 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen and a bedroom. Graham immediately set about making a second sleeping area for himself in the main room, fashioning a bed from spare lumber and a mattress. "The bedroom is yours," he said. "I meant what I said about giving you space." That night, Martha lay in the bedroom alone, listening to the sounds of Graham settling in beyond the door, and felt a strange mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name. Loneliness, perhaps. Or maybe just the awareness that she had married a good man and sent him to sleep on a narrow cot in the other room. Days turned into weeks. They fell into a rhythm, a domestic partnership that felt surprisingly natural. Martha took care of the cabin, cooked meals, and continued helping Mrs. Davidson at the boarding house. Graham worked long hours on the ranch, coming home tired but always greeting Martha with a smile, always asking about her day, always treating her with respect and kindness. True to his word, he never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel pressured. But gradually, Martha found herself wanting to be closer to him. She began sitting nearer to him when they talked in the evenings. She let her hand brush his when passing him dinner. She found excuses to touch his arm, his shoulder, learning the feel of him, growing comfortable with his presence. Graham noticed, of course. He began reciprocating in small ways, his hand resting on the small of her back when he passed behind her in the small kitchen, his fingers lingering when she handed him his coffee in the morning. The tension between them grew, but it was a sweet tension, an anticipation rather than anxiety. One evening, about 6 weeks after their wedding, they were sitting together on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset. Martha had been quiet all day, thinking about something that had been on her mind for a while now. "Graham," she said finally, "how long are you going to keep sleeping on that cot?" He turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "As long as you want me to." "What if I do not want you to anymore?" His breath caught. "Martha, are you sure? You do not have to do anything just because we are married. I meant what I said." "I know you did. That is exactly why I am sure." She reached over and took his hand. "You have been patient and kind. You have given me space to heal, to feel safe. And I do feel safe, Graham. With you, I think I am ready for this to be a real marriage." Graham lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I want that too, more than I can say, but we take this at your pace, all right? You say stop at any time and we stop. No questions, no pressure." Martha nodded, feeling nervous but also excited, eager even. This was her choice made freely, with a man she had come to trust and, yes, care for deeply. She stood and held out her hand to him. "Come to bed, husband." They moved into the bedroom together, and what happened there was tender and careful. Graham constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, making sure she wanted to continue. And Martha, who had spent her whole life afraid of marriage, afraid of the loss of self it represented, found instead a joining, a partnership that made her feel more whole rather than less. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, Martha's head on Graham's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I did not expect this," she said softly. "What? To be happy. To feel like I chose the right path." She lifted her head to look at him. "Thank you for being patient with me." Graham's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on us." As autumn deepened into winter, Martha and Graham's marriage grew stronger. They talked late into the night, learning each other's thoughts and dreams. Graham began sharing his plans for buying land, for building something of their own, and Martha found herself excited by the possibility, eager to be part of creating a future. The threat of her father and Samuel Hutchins hung over them still, but as weeks passed without incident, Martha began to relax. Her father had made no further attempts to claim her, perhaps realizing that the law was no longer on his side. Hutchins had apparently turned his attention to some other potential bride, though Martha felt sorry for whoever that might be. Then, in December, everything changed. Martha had been feeling unwell for a few weeks, tired and queasy in the mornings. Mrs. Davidson, with her years of experience, took one look at Martha and smiled knowingly. "You are expecting, dear," she said gently. Martha's hand went to her stomach, shock and wonder flooding through her. A baby. She was going to have Graham's baby. The idea was terrifying and thrilling all at once. When she told Graham that evening, his face transformed with joy. "A baby," he breathed, then immediately looked concerned. "Are you all right? Do you need to see the doctor? Should you be resting more?" Martha laughed at his sudden, anxious energy. "I am fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But yes, we should probably see the doctor in town, just to make sure everything is going well." Dr. Morrison confirmed what Mrs. Davidson had suspected. Martha was healthy and about 2 months along. The baby would come sometime in late summer. As they left the doctor's office, Graham took Martha's hand, his expression serious. "I want to buy that land now," he said. "Before the baby comes, I want us to have our own place, somewhere we can raise our family." "We have the cabin," Martha pointed out. "That is Mrs. Davidson's property. I want something that is ours. I have enough saved for a down payment on a good piece of land, enough to start building a house. Will you help me pick it out?" So they began looking at available parcels around Oro Blanco. Most were too rocky, too remote, or too expensive. But finally, they found a beautiful 100 acres about 3 miles from the Davidson Ranch, with good grazing land, a stream running through it, and a stand of cottonwood trees that would provide shade. Graham negotiated with the owner and managed to buy it for a reasonable price. They spent every spare moment over the winter and into spring working on building a house. It was small but solidly built, with 2 bedrooms, a generous kitchen, and a porch that looked out over the land they now owned. The men from the Davidson Ranch helped when they could, and Mrs. Davidson contributed furniture and household items to help them get started. By the time they moved in early May, Martha was noticeably pregnant, her belly rounding with their child. Graham was obsessively careful with her, constantly worried she was working too hard, lifting too much, doing too much. Martha found his concern endearing if occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one evening as he tried to take a basket of laundry from her hands. "I know, but I worry. You are the most precious thing in my life, you and our baby." He placed his hand on her belly, and as if in response, the baby kicked. Graham's face lit up. "Did you feel that?" "I have been feeling it for weeks," Martha said with amusement. "But yes, that was a strong one." They stood together in the fading light, Graham's hand on her stomach, feeling their child move within her. Martha thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman locked in a barn, how much her life had changed. She had been so afraid of marriage, of losing herself, but instead she had found a partner, a true companion who treated her as an equal. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now, natural as breathing. "I love you too," Graham replied, pulling her close. More than I ever thought possible. Summer came hot and bright to Arizona territory. Martha grew larger and more uncomfortable as the baby's arrival drew near. In late July, the pain started. Graham, panicked, rode for Mrs. Davidson and the doctor, while Martha tried to stay calm and remember everything the older woman had told her about childbirth. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day. Mrs. Davidson stayed with her throughout, coaching her, encouraging her while Graham paced outside, anxiously waiting. Finally, in the late afternoon, Martha heard the sound she had been waiting for, her baby's first cry. "A boy," Mrs. Davidson announced, placing the squalling infant in Martha's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Martha looked down at her son, at his red, wrinkled face and tiny fists, and felt a wave of love so intense it was almost painful. "Graham," she called, "come meet your son." Graham entered cautiously, as if afraid he might break something. When he saw Martha holding the baby, his eyes filled with tears. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe we made this." They named him Thomas after Graham's father, and watching Graham hold his son, seeing the tenderness on his face, Martha knew she had chosen right. This was what marriage should be: partnership, respect, love, family. The first few months were exhausting as they adjusted to life with a newborn. Thomas was a good baby, generally healthy and happy, but he still required constant attention. Graham helped whenever he could, walking the baby at night when he fussed, changing diapers, anything Martha needed. He never acted as though childcare was beneath him or solely her responsibility. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Martha and Graham's ranch prospered. They added cattle, built more fences, planted a vegetable garden that flourished in the Arizona sun. They hired a young ranch hand named Jack to help with the work, and slowly but surely, they built the life Graham had dreamed of. When Thomas was 2, Martha discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. In the spring, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, a tiny, delicate thing with her father's eyes and her mother's dark hair. Life was busy, chaotic at times, but filled with joy. Martha would sometimes pause in the middle of her day, watching Graham teach Thomas to ride or holding Rose while she slept, and marvel at how happy she was. This was nothing like what she had imagined marriage would be when her father first told her about Samuel Hutchins. This was partnership, love, family in the truest sense. Years passed. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking after his father, eager to help with the ranch work. Rose was spirited and clever, asking endless questions about everything she encountered. When Rose was 4, Martha gave birth to twin boys, much to everyone's surprise. They named them Andrew and William, and the house was suddenly full to bursting with noise and energy. Martha's father never reached out, never tried to mend the rift between them. She heard through the gossip channels that he had fallen on hard times, his ranch failing, his drinking worsening. Samuel Hutchins had indeed married again, a young woman from a family too poor to refuse his suit. Martha prayed for her, but knew there was little she could do beyond send offerings of help through intermediaries, which were always refused. As Martha approached 30, she looked back on the terrified 21-year-old she had been with a mixture of pity and pride. That girl had been so afraid, so convinced she had no options. But she had found the courage to fight for her freedom, and that courage had led her to Graham, to their children, to this life that exceeded anything she had dared dream. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the yard, Graham took her hand. "Do you ever regret it, that it happened the way it did, that you did not get a traditional courtship, flowers and romance and all that?" Martha considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I think if things had been different, if I had not been desperate and you had not been the man to find me, we might never have found each other, and I cannot imagine my life without you." "Me neither," Graham said. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it in the gesture that had become familiar over the years. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Martha Vance. And you are the best thing that ever happened to me, Graham Vance." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, their children ran to them, Thomas carrying Rose on his back while the twins tumbled along behind. They all crowded onto the porch, a tangle of family and love, and Martha felt a contentment so deep it was almost sacred. She thought briefly of that barn, of the darkness and cold and fear. But that night had led to this moment, to this life, to this family. She had been locked away as punishment, but a good man had broken down the door and taken her away. Not to claim her, not to own her, but to offer her a choice, a chance, a new beginning, and she had taken it, and built something beautiful. The seasons continued their cycle. Thomas grew into a young man, falling in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher. They married in a ceremony that was joyful and full of promise, and Martha cried happy tears watching her son begin his own family. Rose showed an unexpected talent for working with horses, training them with a patience and skill that impressed everyone. The twins remained inseparable, always getting into mischief together, but with good hearts. As Martha and Graham entered middle age, their ranch was well established, respected in the community. They had built something substantial from that desperate beginning, a legacy that would pass to their children and grandchildren. The land they had worked so hard to buy and develop now supported not just their family but several families who worked for them, all treated fairly and with respect. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Graham surprised Martha with a trip to town. They left the children with Mrs. Davidson, who was now elderly but still sharp and engaged with their lives. Graham took Martha to the finest restaurant in Oro Blanco, a new establishment that had opened just the year before. Over dinner, he reached across the table and took her hand. 20 years ago, I broke down a barn door and found you. It was the best decision I ever made." "I think I might have made the better deal," Martha said with a smile. "You gave me everything. Freedom, love, family, a home. You gave me a life I never thought I could have." "We gave each other a life," Graham corrected. "This was not just me rescuing you, Martha. You saved me too. I was just going through the motions before we met, working and saving but not really living. You gave me purpose, a reason to build something meaningful." They talked late into the evening, reminiscing about their years together, laughing over the challenges they had faced and overcome. When they finally returned home, they found their children all asleep, sprawled around Mrs. Davidson's sitting room. The older woman smiled at them fondly. "They are good children," she said. "You both should be proud." "We are," Martha said, kissing her cheek. "And much of that is thanks to you. You took a chance on me when you had no reason to. I saw a young woman who needed help and a young man with a good heart. The rest was up to you too." Mrs. Davidson stood slowly, her joints stiff with age. "I should be getting to bed. Old bones do not take kindly to late nights anymore." After she left, Martha and Graham carried their sleeping children out to the wagon for the ride home. Under the vast Arizona night sky, with her family around her and her husband's steady presence beside her, Martha felt complete. The years continued to pass, bringing changes as they always did. Mrs. Davidson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, and Martha mourned her as she would have mourned her own mother. Thomas and his wife had their first baby, making Martha and Graham grandparents. Rose met and married a veterinarian who had moved to Oro Blanco, and they built a practice together. The twins left to seek their fortunes elsewhere, Andrew heading to California and William deciding to study law in New Mexico, but they wrote regularly and visited when they could. Martha's father died when she was 35, his liver finally giving out from years of drinking. She did not go to the funeral, but she did say a prayer for him, forgiving him finally for what he had tried to do to her. She had come to understand that hurt people, that her father's cruelty came from his own pain and disappointment. It did not excuse what he had done, but it allowed her to let go of the anger she had carried. Samuel Hutchins died a few years later, thrown from his horse. His fourth wife remarried within 6 months, and Martha heard she was much happier with her new husband. The cycle of abuse had finally been broken, at least in that instance. As Martha entered her 40s, she began to slow down, to appreciate the quieter moments. She took pleasure in her garden, in teaching her grandchildren to read, in sitting with Graham on their porch in the evenings as they had done for years. The desperate urgency of her youth had mellowed into a peaceful contentment. One evening, as they watched another sunset, Graham turned to her with a serious expression. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "What is it?" "That night I found you in the barn. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had not decided to ride through your father's property. If I had taken the main road instead." Martha shuddered at the thought. "I do not like to think about it, but I am grateful every day that you made the choice you did." "So am I. But Martha, it was not just luck. You chose to trust me. You chose to come with me, to marry me, to build this life with me. You were so brave." "I was terrified," Martha admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite the fear. You did that. You saved yourself. I just happened to be there to help." Martha leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the constant presence that had been her anchor for over 2 decades. "We saved each other," she said, "and we built something beautiful together." As they sat there, their grown children's voices drifting from inside the house where a family dinner was in progress, Martha reflected on the long journey from that dark barn to this moment. She had been locked away as punishment, treated as property, denied her basic rights. But she had refused to accept that fate. She had fought for her freedom, and she had found not just escape but love, partnership, and a life richer than she had ever imagined possible. Graham had broken down that door, yes, but what he had truly broken was the cycle of control and abuse that had defined Martha's family for generations. Together, they had created something new, a marriage built on respect and equality, a family raised with love rather than fear. Their children would never know the terror of being locked away, the desperation of having no choices. They would grow up knowing they had value beyond what they could provide someone else. The sun dipped below the horizon, and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, Martha could hear her grandchildren laughing, Thomas's deep voice telling a story, Rose singing as she helped with the dishes. The house was full of life and love, a sharp contrast to the cold, dark barn where her journey to freedom had begun. "Come on," Graham said, standing and offering her his hand. "They will be wondering where we are." Martha took his hand, his touch as familiar now as her own heartbeat, and let him help her to her feet. Together they walked inside, into the warmth and light, into the midst of the family they had created. And Martha knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed were gentle ones. Martha and Graham grew old together, their hair graying, their steps slower, but their love as strong as ever. They became the respected elders of the community, known for their fairness and generosity. Young couples would sometimes come to them for advice, and Martha would tell an edited version of her story, emphasizing the importance of mutual respect and partnership in marriage. Their ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and they were able to divide portions of it among their children, ensuring each had a secure future. The land that Graham had bought with his hard-earned savings now supported an extended family network, a testament to the vision he had held as a young man. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration that brought together what seemed like the entire town. As Martha looked around at the gathered crowd, at the life she and Graham had built, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. So much could have gone differently. She could have submitted to her father's demands, married Samuel Hutchins, and lived a life of quiet desperation until it killed her. But instead, she had been locked in a barn and a cowboy had broken down the door. And in that moment of rescue, both their lives had changed forever, set on a course that led to this moment, to this family, to this love. That night, after everyone had gone home and it was just the two of them again, Martha and Graham lay in bed together, her head on his shoulder as it had been countless times over the decades. "Graham," she said softly. "Yes, love, thank you for saving me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "I love you. I have loved you for so long now, I barely remember what it felt like not to love you. I love you too, Martha. You have been my greatest adventure, my truest companion, my home." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, two souls that had found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. When Graham fell ill 3 years later at the age of 68, Martha nursed him with the same devotion he had shown her throughout their marriage. The doctor said it was his heart, weakened by years of hard work and, ironically, worn out by decades of love. Graham faced his approaching death with the same quiet courage he had faced everything else in life. "I am not afraid," he told Martha one evening as she sat by his bedside. "I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. I have seen my children grow and thrive. I have no regrets." "I am not ready to let you go," Martha said, tears streaming down her face. "I know. But Martha, you will be all right. You are the strongest person I know. You survived your father. You built a life from nothing. You will survive this too. But I do not want to survive without you." Graham reached up with a shaking hand and cupped her cheek. "You will not be without me. I will always be with you in every sunset we watched together, in every stone of this house we built, in our children and grandchildren. Death can take my body, but it cannot take what we have shared." He died peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by his family with Martha holding his hand. She felt the moment he left, felt his spirit release, and though her heart shattered with grief, she also felt gratitude for every moment they had shared. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Graham had touched with his kindness and integrity. Martha stood dry-eyed through the service, her children around her, drawing strength from their presence. She mourned deeply and truly, but she did not break. Graham had been right. She was strong enough to survive even this. In the years after Graham's death, Martha found a new purpose in being the family matriarch. She helped with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the stories of her and Graham's life, ensuring that future generations understood the values they had held dear. She worked with Rose to establish a shelter for women fleeing bad situations, a way of paying forward the help she had received decades earlier. She lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by a family that stretched across generations, all of them carrying forward the legacy of respect, love, and courage that she and Graham had established. On her deathbed, her children and grandchildren gathered around her. "Tell us again," her youngest granddaughter asked. "Tell us how you and Grandpa met." So Martha told the story one last time, about a dark barn and a locked door, about a cowboy who heard someone in distress and chose to help, about a desperate woman who chose to trust a stranger. She told them about building a life together, about love growing from respect, about partnership and family and the home they had created. "Remember," she said, her voice growing faint, "that you always have a choice. Sometimes the choices are hard, sometimes the consequences are uncertain, but you always have a choice. Choose love, choose respect, choose courage." As night fell, Martha closed her eyes and felt Graham's presence as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. She reached out, and in her mind, his hand closed around hers, warm and steady as it had been for 43 years of marriage. "I am coming, my love," she whispered. And Martha Vance, who had once been a frightened girl locked in a barn, who had been saved by a good man with a kind heart, who had built a life of love and meaning from the most desperate of beginnings, passed peacefully into whatever lay beyond, secure in the knowledge that she had lived fully and loved well. Her story lived on in her descendants, in the ranch that still bore the Vance name, in the shelter that helped women find their own paths to freedom. The barn where her journey began had long since been torn down, but the house she and Graham built together still stood, occupied now by Thomas's grandson, filled with the laughter of yet another generation. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Arizona hills in brilliant shades of gold and orange, people swore they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the old Vance house, hand in hand, watching the day end together, just as they had done for so many years when they lived, just as they would do for eternity now that they had passed beyond. The love between Martha and Graham Vance had been born in darkness and desperation, but it had grown into something luminous and eternal, a beacon of hope for all who heard their story. It proved that even in the hardest circumstances, even when the world seemed determined to crush your spirit, love could flourish, partnership could thrive, and two souls could find each other and build something beautiful that would outlast their mortal lives. That was the legacy of the night a cowboy broke down a barn door and took away a woman who needed saving. Not just her rescue, but the life they built together after, the family they raised, the love they shared, and the example they set for generations to come. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, forged in adversity, and refined through decades of partnership into something pure and unbreakable. And so the story ends not with death, but with life continuing, with love persisting, with the promise that courage and kindness and choosing each other every day can create miracles. Martha and Graham Vance had lived and loved and left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask for?